This is a fictional story that honors the spirit of American valor. Names, places, and events are created for dramatic effect. Before we begin, do one thing. Look around. Your home, your family, your freedom. Now imagine losing it all while no one believes the sacrifice you made to protect it. This is a fictional story about Colonel James Mitchell, a man Riverside Ridge, Montana, called crazy for 23 years. A man mocked, dismissed, and forgotten by the very community around him. But on November 11, 2019, a single letter arrived that would shatter everything this town thought they knew and reveal a secret so profound, it would bring an entire community to its knees. If you're watching this, you believe in honor, in sacrifice, in second chances. Hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why some heroes walk among us in silence until the moment their truth can no longer be ignored. Now let me tell you about the day Colonel James Mitchell walked into Betty's diner and changed Riverside Ridge, Montana forever. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November 2019, the kind where your breath fogs up the windows and frost clings to the flagpole outside Riverside Ridge's post office. Betty's diner, a staple on Main Street since 1962, was buzzing with the usual morning crowd. Ranchers nursing black coffee, high school teachers grading papers between bites of scrambled eggs, and a handful of retired veterans swapping stories near the back booth. The door swung open. A gust of icy wind swept through, carrying with it the smell of pine and snow. And there he stood, Colonel James Mitchell. At 73 years old, he was a ghost of what he once was. His frame, once broad and commanding, had withered under the weight of time and isolation. He wore a faded army jacket, green and worn at the elbows, with patches barely visible through years of weathering. His grey hair stuck out from beneath a veteran's cap, and his pale blue eyes carried a 1,000-yard stare that made people look away. The diner went quiet, not the respectful kind of quiet you offer a decorated war hero. No, this was the uncomfortable silence reserved for people you'd rather not acknowledge. The kind that says, "Not him," again. Now, before I continue, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Are you in Montana? Maybe you've been to a town just like Riverside Ridge. Drop your city and state in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. Because what happened next, it could happen anywhere in America. Betty Lawson, the diner's owner and a woman known for her warm pies and even warmer heart, glanced up from the register. Her smile faltered when she saw James. It wasn't hatred in her eyes. It was something worse. Pity. "Morning, Colonel," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded but didn't speak. He never spoke much anymore. He shuffled toward the counter, his boots scraping against the linoleum floor. As he passed, a young waitress, Sarah Chen, 22 and fresh out of college, leaned over to her coworker and whispered just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Is that the guy everyone talks about? The one with all those wild stories?" Her coworker, Mike, smirked. "Yeah, that's him. My uncle says he's been telling the same tale for decades. People whispered he was making it up." Sarah glanced at James, watching him settle onto his usual stool, and felt a twinge of something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Guilt? She pushed it aside and returned to refilling coffee. James heard every word. He always did. And he remembered everything. You see, Riverside Ridge had long since decided who Colonel James Mitchell was. To them, he wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a man worthy of respect. He was the local eccentric, the old guy who muttered to himself at the grocery store, the veteran who showed up every Veterans Day at the town memorial, standing silently while others gave speeches, but never invited to speak himself. Why? Because 23 years ago, when James Mitchell first arrived in Riverside Ridge after retiring from the military, he told a story so unbelievable, so extraordinary, that the town dismissed him. He claimed he had been part of a classified operation during a war, an operation so secretive records were sealed, an operation where he saved 37 soldiers but received no recognition, no proof. Just another old vet with stories, they said. And so James Mitchell became the man nobody believed. James took his seat at the far end of the counter, the same stool he'd occupied for the past 2 decades. The red vinyl cushion had a permanent indent shaped exactly like him, a silent testament to how many mornings he'd spent here, alone with his thoughts and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Betty approached with the pot, her movements automatic, practiced. "The usual, Colonel?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. James nodded. "Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter." He never ordered anything else, never caused trouble, never raised his voice. He simply existed, a fixture in the diner as permanent and ignored as the old jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a song since 1998. As Betty walked away, James's weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug she'd placed before him. His fingers, gnarled from arthritis and old injuries, trembled slightly. Not from weakness, but from memory. Because every time James Mitchell sat in this diner, every time he heard the whispers and felt the stares, he was transported back. Back to the jungle, back to the chaos, back to the 37 lives whose fate hung on decisions made in mere seconds. Let me take you back to a fictionalized version of that moment. Back to when James Mitchell wasn't the town eccentric. Back when he was Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, 31 years old, leading a reconnaissance unit in hostile territory. It was late March. The air was thick with humidity and the constant buzz of insects. Mitchell's unit, with a classified designation, had been inserted deep into dangerous terrain to gather intelligence on enemy movements. 12 men. 12 of the best soldiers you could imagine, but intelligence was wrong. They weren't facing a small patrol. They were walking straight into a heavily fortified position with overwhelming numbers against them. When the ambush came, it came fast. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides. Mitchell's radio operator went down in the first burst of fire. His medic took shrapnel from an explosion that detonated just feet away. Within 90 seconds, Mitchell's team was pinned down with zero cover and no way to call for help. They were going to die. All of them. But then Mitchell saw it, a narrow ravine barely visible through the smoke and chaos. A way out, but it meant leaving their position. It meant breaking standard protocol. It meant trusting instinct over orders. "Move, move now," Mitchell screamed, grabbing his wounded medic and dragging him toward the ravine. His men followed without hesitation. For 6 hours, Mitchell led what remained of his unit through hostile territory, carrying the wounded, setting defensive positions, fusing every bit of training they'd ever received. When they finally reached a clearing where evacuation could happen, only 8 of his 12 men were still alive. But here's the part that changed everything. As the helicopter descended, Mitchell saw movement in the tree line. Not enemies, fellow soldiers. A separate unit had been overrun. Survivors were fleeing toward the same extraction point. 37 men, wounded, exhausted, out of ammunition. The helicopter had room for maybe 15 people maximum. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Colonel, we gotta go now. We're taking fire. I can't hold this position." Mitchell looked at his men, then at the soldiers emerging from the jungle. Young men, barely out of their teens, covered in blood and mud and terror. He made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "Load them first," Mitchell said, gesturing to the other unit. His radio man grabbed his arm. "Sir, if we don't get on that bird, we're dead." Mitchell's jaw tightened. His voice was steel. "Load them first." What happened next became the ghost that haunted James Mitchell for decades. The helicopter lifted off with 37 men from the other unit crammed inside, packed beyond safety limits. Mitchell and his remaining 7 soldiers stayed behind. They held that landing zone for another 40 agonizing minutes, fighting off multiple assaults with salvage weapons and pure determination until a second helicopter finally arrived. Every single one of those 37 men survived. Every single one went home to their families. And every single one of them owed their survival to Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell. But because the mission was classified, because certain operations officially didn't exist in the records, there was no medal ceremony, no parade, no public recognition, just a private moment with a senior officer and a promise that felt hollow even then. What you did will be remembered, except it wasn't, not officially, not publicly, not in any way that mattered when James tried to tell his story years later. James blinked, the sounds of distant combat fading back into the quiet clatter of breakfast dishes. He was back in Betty's diner, back in Riverside Ridge, Montana, back in the life he'd built from the fragments of a story nobody believed. Across the room he could see them, the morning regulars. Bob Henderson, a retired sheriff, reading the sports section. Tom Crawford, who owned the hardware store, arguing about local politics. Linda Shaw, a schoolteacher, grading papers with decisive red marks. Good people, hard-working people. People who thought he was living in a fantasy. James had tried in the early years to explain. He'd shown them his discharge papers, honorable service with commendations. He'd shown them photographs of himself in uniform, though key details were always redacted or obscured. But he had no proof of that mission. No documentation. Requests for his service records were met with bureaucratic walls and polite suggestions to let it go. So Riverside Ridge decided for him. If he couldn't prove it, it didn't happen. And James Mitchell became the quiet man who lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of town, spending his days chopping wood and his nights staring at a wall covered with maps and old photographs, trying to hold on to memories that were slowly fading like old newspaper clippings left in the sun. Sarah Chen, the young waitress, watched James from behind the counter as she prepared orders. Something about him bothered her. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made her think. Her own grandfather had been a veteran. He died when she was 12, but she remembered his stories, the way adults would sometimes dismiss them as exaggerations. She remembered finding a box in his attic after he passed, full of medals and citations her family never knew existed. What if, she thought, what if everyone was wrong about the old colonel? If you're still with me, if this story is resonating with you the way I hope it is, pause for just 5 seconds and hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next, what James Mitchell was about to discover, will restore your faith in truth, in justice, in the power of patience and persistence. Reminder, this narrative is fictional. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away in Washington, D.C., a different story was unfolding. Martin Greaves, a 68-year-old military historian, sat in his cramped office surrounded by filing boxes and decades-old documents. For 3 years, he'd been fighting to get certain classified records declassified, not for glory, not for fame, but because he believed that some truths deserved to see daylight before everyone who lived them was gone. Martin had been a young analyst during the conflict James Mitchell had served in. He'd seen names in reports that later vanished, units that were scrubbed from official histories, men who'd done extraordinary things that would never be acknowledged. It gnawed at him. So when he retired, he made it his mission to correct at least some of these omissions. The operation James had been part of was his white whale. He'd filed Freedom of Information Act requests, been denied, filed appeals, been denied again. He'd called old contacts, tracked down retired officers, pieced together fragments of information like an archaeologist reconstructing pottery shards. Most people told him to give up. Let sleeping dogs lie. Some secrets are kept for good reason. But Martin was stubborn. And then last month, something changed. He received a phone call from a hospice in Virginia. A retired senior officer, facing his final weeks, wanted to talk. Martin drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to get there. The officer, rail-thin and breathing with difficulty, handed him a folder. Names, dates, locations, the missing pieces Martin had been searching for. "I can't take these secrets with me," the officer whispered. "These men deserve better." At the top of the list of names was Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, with a last known address in Riverside Ridge, Montana. Martin spent the next 2 weeks verifying everything, cross-referencing dates, confirming details with other sources. And slowly, incredibly, the full picture emerged. Not only was Mitchell's story real, it was more remarkable than anyone could have guessed. The decision he'd made in that jungle had cascading effects. Those 37 men he'd saved had gone on to have lives, families, careers. Martin did the mathematics. Direct descendants alone numbered in the hundreds. He knew he needed to do more than just file a report. These men, the ones Mitchell saved, needed to know. Needed to be found. Martin started making calls. It took weeks. Some numbers were disconnected. Some families had moved. But one by one he found them. David Patterson in Ohio, Marcus Williams in Texas, Robert Chen in California. Each conversation the same. You might not remember the name James Mitchell, but he saved your life. And each time a long silence, followed by tears, followed by a single question. Where is he now? It was 3 days after that morning at Betty's Diner when everything changed for James. He was at home splitting firewood in his backyard. The Montana cold had settled in early that year, and winter preparation was a ritual he'd learned to find peace in. His cabin was small, just 1 bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a living room dominated by that wall of memories that had become both shrine and burden. He heard the mail truck rumble down the gravel road, heard the metallic squeak of his mailbox opening and closing. James didn't get much mail anymore. A pension check once a month, occasional flyers from the VA hospital in Great Falls. That was about it. But when he walked down his driveway, boots crunching on frost-covered gravel, and opened the mailbox, there was something different. An envelope, thick, official-looking, addressed to Colonel James Mitchell, retired, Riverside Ridge, Montana. No return address. Just a postmark from Toledo, Ohio. James's hands shook as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed formal. And as his eyes scanned the words, his knees nearly buckled. He had to grab the mailbox to steady himself. The letter read, "Colonel Mitchell, you don't know me, but my name is David Patterson. 48 years ago, you made a decision that saved my life. I was 19 years old, terrified and certain I was going to die. You put me on a helicopter when you should have saved yourself. You stayed behind so I could go home. I've thought about you every single day since. For decades I tried to find you, but the unit designation was classified. Your name was redacted from documents I could access. It was like you never existed, until last month when a historian named Martin Greaves called me. He'd been working for years to get records declassified. A dying officer finally gave him the truth. Your truth. I'm not alone. We found the others. All 37 of us. We're coming to Riverside Ridge. We're bringing proof. We're bringing our families. And we're going to make sure the world knows what you did. See you November 11th. David Patterson, former sergeant, now a man who owes you everything." James Mitchell read that letter 17 times. He read it standing in his driveway, breath visible in the cold air. He read it sitting at his kitchen table, hands trembling. He read it at 3 in the morning when sleep refused to come, the paper now wrinkled and soft from his fingerprints. November 11th, Veterans Day, 11 days away. For the first time in 23 years, James Mitchell allowed himself to feel something he'd locked away deep in his chest, buried beneath decades of silence and dismissal. Hope. But hope is a dangerous thing for a man who's been called delusional for half his life. Because hope means vulnerability. Hope means the possibility that this could all be a misunderstanding, another disappointment, another reason for people to shake their heads. So James did what he'd always done. He waited. He chopped his firewood. He drank his coffee at Betty's diner, alone, ignored, invisible. He stared at his wall of memories and wondered if David Patterson was real, if any of this was real. The days crawled by. November 5th, November 7th, November 9th. Back at the diner, Sarah Chen couldn't stop thinking about the old colonel. She'd gone home that night and asked her mother about him. "Oh, him," her mother had said dismissively. "He's been telling tall tales for years. Your uncle tried to be friendly once, but the stories were just too much." Sarah wasn't satisfied. That evening, she went up to her attic and found the box from her grandfather. The medals, the citations, the photographs. She read through them carefully for the first time as an adult. Her grandfather had never talked much about his service either. He'd been quiet about it, private, and her family had never pushed. What if they'd been wrong? What if they'd missed something important? Sarah made a decision. The next morning, when James came in for his usual coffee, she was going to sit down and actually listen. Really listen. Not with judgment or skepticism, but with the respect he might deserve. And then finally, November 11th, 2019, Veterans Day. James woke before dawn, as he always did. His body was a clock calibrated by decades of military discipline, up at 5 a.m. without fail. He showered, shaved carefully, his hand steadier than it had been in years, and then he walked to his closet and pulled out something he hadn't worn in a very, very long time. His dress uniform, Army service greens, pressed and preserved in a garment bag since 1995. The last time he'd worn it to a military funeral for a friend who'd believed his story. James laid it on his bed and stared at it for a long moment. The jacket still fit, though it hung a little looser on his shoulders now. The ribbons, rows of them, each one representing a campaign, a mission, a moment of sacrifice, gleamed in the morning light. There was his Purple Heart, his Bronze Star, his Army Commendation Medal, but there was one ribbon missing, the one that mattered most. The one that would have represented that day in the jungle. Because officially it never happened. James buttoned his jacket slowly, each button a prayer, a hope, a question mark hanging in the air. By 8 a.m., he was standing in front of his bathroom mirror, looking at a man he barely recognized. Colonel James Mitchell, not the eccentric from Betty's Diner, not the dismissed storyteller, a soldier. At 9 a.m., the Veterans Day ceremony was scheduled to begin at Riverside Ridge Memorial Park, a small patch of grass near the center of town, with a granite monument listing the names of local residents who'd served. Every year, the mayor gave a speech. The high school band played the national anthem off-key. A few veterans laid wreaths, and every year James stood in the back silent and unseen, a ghost at his own memorial. But today might be different. I need to know, are you feeling this? Are you rooting for James right now? Drop an American flag in the comments if you want this man to finally get the recognition he deserves. Because what happens next, it's going to break you in the most beautiful way possible. By the time James arrived at Riverside Ridge Memorial Park, the crowd was already gathering. Maybe 200 people, families with children holding small flags, veterans in various uniforms, curious townspeople who came out of tradition more than reverence. James parked his old pickup truck on the outskirts and walked toward the ceremony, his uniform drawing surprised glances and whispered comments. Is that James Mitchell? What's he doing in full dress? He's really committed to this fantasy, isn't he? James kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his shoulders back. Military bearing never really leaves you, even after decades. He found his usual spot far back near the edge of the park, beneath an old oak tree where he could observe without being noticed. The mayor, Douglas Brennan, stepped up to the microphone, a portly man in his 60s with thinning hair and a politician's practiced smile. Good morning, Riverside Ridge. Thank you all for joining us on this special day, as we honor the brave men and women who've served our great nation. The speech was the same every year, generic platitudes, hollow thank yous, the kind of words that sound important but carry no weight. James barely listened. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for something, someone he wasn't even sure existed. Maybe David Patterson had changed his mind. Maybe this was all a cruel hoax. Maybe he was still the crazy old man everyone thought he was. Maybe, and then he heard it. The low rumble of engines, not just one or two, a convoy. The crowd turned, confused, as a line of vehicles rolled down Main Street toward the park. Pickup trucks, SUVs, sedans, all of them flying American flags from their windows. All of them moving with military precision, forming a single file line that stretched half a block. The mayor's voice faltered mid-sentence. Parents pulled their children closer, uncertain what was happening. The lead vehicle, a black Ford F-250 with Ohio plates, pulled to a stop directly in front of the memorial. The engine cut off. For a moment, there was only silence and the whisper of flags in the November wind. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man. He was in his late 60s, tall and lean, wearing a crisp army dress uniform with the rank of Sergeant Major embroidered on his sleeve. His gray hair was cut high and tight. His posture was ramrod straight, the bearing of a man who'd spent a lifetime in service. He looked directly at James Mitchell, standing 50 feet away beneath that oak tree. Their eyes met, and then slowly, deliberately, the man raised his hand in a crisp military salute. David Patterson, the 19-year-old terrified soldier from that jungle 48 years ago. Now a man, a survivor, a witness. Behind him, the other vehicles began to empty. One by one, men stepped out, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes with veteran caps. But every single one of them moved with unmistakable military bearing. 10 men, 20, 30, 37, every single person. James Mitchell had saved on that day in March 1971. The crowd at the memorial went absolutely silent. You could hear the flag snapping in the wind. A child's question quickly shushed by a parent. The mayor's microphone feedback suddenly too loud. And James Mitchell, the man Riverside Ridge had called delusional for 23 years, felt his knees go weak. His vision blurred. He grabbed the oak tree for support. David Patterson walked toward James slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the colonel's face. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. When David was 10 feet away, he stopped. The entire town of Riverside Ridge watched, confused, curious, beginning to sense that something profound was happening. Colonel James Mitchell, David said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, clear as a bell. 48 years ago, you saved my life. You put me on a helicopter when you should have saved yourself. You stayed behind so I could go home to my mother, my future, everything I would become." James opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was tight. 23 years of silence, of not being believed, of carrying this alone, came crashing down on him all at once. David continued, his voice growing stronger. "For 3 decades I tried to find you. The army told me your unit didn't exist. They told me there was no record of the operation. They told me to stop asking questions, that some things were better left classified," the crowd murmured. James could see faces turning toward him. Betty from the diner, her hand over her mouth. Bob Henderson, the sheriff, his newspaper forgotten. Linda Shaw, the teacher, her red pen frozen mid-mark. Sarah Chen, tears already streaming down her young face. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. 2 months ago, David said, a military historian named Martin Greaves called me. He'd been fighting for years to get certain records declassified. A senior officer on his deathbed finally broke ranks and provided the truth. Your truth. David opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were documents, mission reports with formerly blacked out sections now visible. Lists of names, maps with coordinates, combat action reports, and photographs. David held up a black and white photograph, faded and cracked with age but unmistakable. It showed a young Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, face covered in mud and blood, exhausted beyond measure, surrounded by 37 soldiers in a jungle clearing. The helicopter visible in the background. This, David said, his voice breaking, is the man who the government kept classified for national security reasons. This is the man who sacrificed his career, his recognition, his future, so 37 strangers could have theirs. Tears were streaming down David's weathered face now, carving tracks through skin that had seen 70 winters. This is the man Riverside Ridge called delusional. The silence was deafening. A woman in the crowd gasped. David turned to face the entire gathering, his voice rising with passion and pain. "My name is David Patterson. I'm 73 years old. I live in Toledo, Ohio. I have 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 3 weeks ago my daughter told me I'm going to be a great-grandfather. I was a teacher for 35 years, coached Little League Baseball, served on my city council. None of that would exist if this man hadn't made the choice he made." He gestured to the men standing behind him, 37 witnesses to truth. "These men," David continued, "teachers, engineers, police officers, business owners, fathers, grandfathers, we all owe our lives to Colonel James Mitchell. We came here today from 17 different states to make sure this town, this community, knows the truth that was kept from everyone for nearly 5 decades." One by one, the 37 men stepped forward. An older black man with gray dreadlocks and kind eyes. "He carried me 2 miles with a bullet in my leg," he said simply. "I'm Marcus Williams. I'm a retired police chief from Houston. I have 6 grandchildren because of this man." A stocky Hispanic man in a worn veteran of foreign wars jacket. "He gave me his last canteen when I was dying of dehydration," he said. "I'm Robert Chen. I own a restaurant in Sacramento. My family's American dream exists because he stayed behind," a thin white man with a Purple Heart pin on his civilian jacket. "He held my hand while I said what I thought were my last prayers," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Then he made sure they weren't my last. I'm Thomas O'Brien. I became a minister. I've baptized over 1,000 children in my career. Every single one of them exists in a timeline where this man chose others over himself. Each testimony was a hammer blow to the town's collective conscience. Each story was a brick in a wall of proof too massive to ignore. And with every word, the people of Riverside Ridge began to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. How they'd dismissed a hero as a fantasist. How they'd walked past him for 23 years without really seeing him. Betty Lawson was the first to move. The diner owner, the woman who'd served James coffee with pity in her eyes for 2 decades, walked toward him with tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. "Colonel Mitchell," she whispered, her voice breaking into pieces. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We should have listened. We should have believed. Oh God, we should have believed you." James looked at her, and for the first time in 23 years, someone in Riverside Ridge truly saw him, really saw him. Not the eccentric, not the man with wild stories, but the soldier, the hero, the man who'd carried the weight of 37 lives in silence while the world called him a liar. "It's okay, Betty," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. But it wasn't okay. They both knew it. Bob Henderson, the retired sheriff, removed his hat and approached next, his face crumpled with shame. "Sir," he said, the word catching in his throat, "I called you a liar. To your face. 5 years ago at the 4th of July picnic, I told you to stop disrespecting real veterans with your made-up stories. So I told half the town you were disgracing the uniform." James said nothing. Bob's voice cracked. "I was wrong. God forgive me, I was so wrong. I'm sorry, sir. I'm so damn sorry." One by one, the people of Riverside Ridge came forward. Tom Crawford from the hardware store, who'd dismissed James's stories as senile ramblings. Linda Shaw, the teacher, who told her students to be kind to the poor, confused old man, but not to believe his tales. Sarah Chen, the young waitress who just days earlier had whispered jokes about him, now sobbing so hard she could barely walk. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm sorry. I should have listened. My grandfather was like you. I should have known better." All of them ashamed. All of them broken by the weight of their judgment. And James Mitchell, the man who'd carried the burden of 37 lives and 23 years of silence with dignity, simply nodded to each of them. No anger in his eyes, no resentment, just acceptance, because that's what soldiers do. They carry the weight so others don't have to. Even when that weight is misunderstanding, even when that weight is being called crazy, they carry it. If you're crying right now, you're not alone. If you're thinking about someone in your life you've judged too quickly, someone whose story you never really heard, someone you dismissed without knowing their truth, leave their name in the comments. Because this story isn't just about James Mitchell. It's about all of us. It's about the heroes we walk past every single day without seeing them. David Patterson wasn't finished. He gestured to a man standing near the vehicles, an elderly gentleman in a suit carrying a leather briefcase. "This is Martin Greaves," David announced to the crowd. "He's a military historian who's been fighting for years to get these records declassified. He's the reason we're all here today, the reason the truth finally came out." Martin stepped forward, his movement slow but purposeful. He set the briefcase on a nearby bench and opened it carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martin said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime studying truth. "What happened on March 28, 1971, in a classified operation, was one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in modern military history. Colonel Mitchell and his unit held off overwhelming enemy forces for over 6 hours, enabling the complete evacuation of friendly forces with 0 casualties among those evacuated." He pulled out more documents, official ones with Department of Defense letterhead. For decades, this operation remained classified under national security protocols. But as of October 2019, following the death of a senior officer and subsequent appeals under the Freedom of Information Act, portions of this file have been declassified. Martin held up an official document, seal visible even from a distance. Colonel James Mitchell has been awarded long overdue recognition for extraordinary heroism in action. The crowd gasped collectively. "Additionally," Martin continued, his voice thick with emotion, "he is receiving multiple commendations he never received due to classification, and a unit citation that was kept sealed for national security reasons. These honors are 48 years late, but they're real. His story is real, and we're going to make sure every person in this country knows what he did." David Patterson stepped beside James, his voice breaking. "Colonel, these recognitions are nearly 5 decades late, but they're real. Your story is real. Your sacrifice is real. And we're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure everyone knows what you did for us." James Mitchell, the man who'd been called delusional for 23 years, finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said. "I know," David replied, tears flowing freely now. "That's exactly why you deserve it. What happened next in Riverside Ridge, Montana, wasn't just a ceremony. It was a reckoning, a moment of collective awakening." The mayor stepped aside, speechless for perhaps the first time in his political career, as David Patterson took the microphone. "Colonel Mitchell," David said, his voice echoing across the now silent crowd, "would you please come forward?" James hesitated. For 23 years, He'd stood in the shadows of this memorial, watching others be honored while he remained invisible, a ghost at the edges. Now every single eye in Riverside Ridge was on him. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward the front. The crowd parted, people stepping back not out of disrespect this time, but out of reverence, out of shame, out of a sudden understanding of who had been walking among them all these years unrecognized. When James reached the memorial, David Patterson saluted again, and this time, all 37 men behind him snapped to attention in perfect unison and saluted as one. The sight of 37 veterans, men who'd lived full lives, had families, built careers, all saluting one man with tears streaming down their weathered faces, broke something fundamental in Riverside Ridge. Betty Lawson sobbed openly, her hands covering her mouth, her entire body shaking. Bob Henderson stood at attention, tears streaming down his weathered face, decades of wrong judgment crushing him. Even Sarah Chen, young enough to be James's granddaughter, stood frozen with her hand over her heart, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd witnessed every day in that diner without truly seeing. David Patterson lowered his salute and stepped closer to James, close enough that their conversation felt intimate, even in front of 200 witnesses. "Sir," he said softly, "I need to tell you something I've been carrying for 48 years, a weight I need you to understand." James met his eyes, and in that moment, two old soldiers saw each other completely. "When you put me on that helicopter," David continued, "when you told me to live, I didn't just survive that day. I went home to Toledo, Ohio. 3 years later, I met my wife Karen at a church social. We got married, had 4 kids. Those kids gave us 9 grandchildren. And just last month, my daughter told me I'm going to be a great-grandfather." David's voice broke completely. "That's 87 people, Colonel. 87 lives that exist in this world because you chose to save mine instead of yourself." He turned to the other men, his brothers in survival. "How many of you have children?" Every single hand went up. 37 hands in the air. "Grandchildren?" 30 hands. "Great-grandchildren?" 18 hands. "Great-great-grandchildren?" 3 hands went up. David turned back to the crowd, his voice rising with the weight of truth too long suppressed. "We did the math, Colonel. We hired a professional genealogist to trace it all. Between the 37 of us standing here today, there are now 643 direct descendants. 643 human beings who are alive, breathing, laughing, loving, living on this earth because of one decision you made in a jungle on the other side of the world." The crowd gasped. Parents held their children tighter. Veterans in the crowd stood at attention without being asked. James Mitchell's knees buckled. The sheer weight of that number, the magnitude of those ripple effects, was too much to bear standing. David caught him, held him steady, supported the man who'd supported so many. 643, David repeated, his voice gentle now. Teachers, doctors, police officers, musicians, scientists, artists, parents, children, grandchildren, all of them because of you. All of them existing in a timeline where you chose others over yourself. Martin Greaves stepped forward, carrying a wooden case lined with blue velvet. Inside were the commendations. He opened the case slowly, each movement deliberate, sacred, witnessed by an entire town holding its collective breath. "Colonel James Mitchell," Martin said formally, "on behalf of a grateful nation and the historical record that was incomplete for too long, I present to you these long overdue recognitions for extraordinary heroism in action." He lifted a medal, bronze and gleaming despite its age, hanging from a ribbon of red, white and blue. The crowd erupted in applause, but Martin wasn't finished. More commendations followed. For gallantry in action, for wounds received in combat, for leadership under impossible circumstances, for choosing others when choosing himself would have been justified. James's hand trembled as each one was placed around his neck or pinned to his chest. The weight of them, both literal and metaphorical, made him sway slightly. And finally, Martin said, his voice thick with emotion, barely contained, a unit citation for an operation that officially didn't exist, but whose sacrifice saved 49 American lives. He pinned the citation to James's chest right above his heart, and then something happened that no one in Riverside Ridge expected. Something that would be talked about in this town for generations. David Patterson, a man who'd been a teacher, a father, a pillar of his community for 50 years, dropped to one knee. Then Marcus Williams, then Robert Chen, then another man, and another. One by one, like dominoes of devotion, all 37 men, these grandfathers, these survivors, these witnesses to an act of valor that had been hidden for decades, knelt before Colonel James Mitchell. There are moments in life that transcend words, moments where the only appropriate response is silence, respect, reverence, or at the presence of something greater than ourselves. This was one of them. The entire crowd watched, many of them now on their own knees as 37 men paid homage to one. James looked down at them, at these men he'd carried, men he'd bled for, men he'd chosen to save at the cost of his own immediate safety, men who'd lived entire lifetimes because of a split-second decision made in chaos and fire. And for the first time in 23 years, Colonel James Mitchell allowed himself to cry in public. Not tears of sadness or bitterness, not tears of anger or resentment, tears of release, tears of validation, tears of a burden finally shared after decades of carrying it alone. The crowd watched this old soldier weep and understood that they were witnessing something holy. If this moment right here, if this story has changed how you see the quiet heroes around you, if it's reminded you that every person has a story worth hearing, worth believing, worth honoring, then do me a favor. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it, because stories like James Mitchell's don't just honor the past. They change the future. They change how we see the present. They change us. The mayor tried to take back control to regain the ceremony, but David Patterson wasn't done. The men rose from their knees, but the reverence remained. "Colonel," David said gently, "I think Riverside Ridge would like to hear from you, if you're willing to speak." James stared at the microphone like it was both salvation and terror. He'd waited 23 years for this moment, 23 years of being dismissed, mocked, pitied, and now they wanted to listen. Now they were ready to hear. James took the microphone slowly. His hand shook. His voice, when it came, was rough from decades of measured silence. He paused, cleared his throat, started again. "I didn't do it for medals. I didn't do it for recognition or parades or having a street named after me." The crowd leaned in, hanging on every word. "I did it because those men deserved to go home. They deserved to see their families again, to live lives, to have futures, to become teachers and fathers and the men standing before you today." He looked at the 37 witnesses to his truth. "You asked me why I stayed behind, why I gave up my seat on that helicopter, why I risked everything." James's voice grew stronger, decades of silence breaking like a dam. "Because in that moment, I understood something fundamental about service. Being a soldier isn't about the uniform. It's not about the rank or the medals or the glory or the recognition. It's about making the choice to stand between danger and the people who can't protect themselves. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything so that others can have something. Anything, a chance, a future, a life." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, across the town that had dismissed him, and in his gaze was not anger but understanding. "For 23 years I've lived in Riverside Ridge. I've watched your children grow up. I've seen your families celebrate holidays. I've witnessed your lives continue. Births, weddings, graduations, and you know what?" His voice cracked with emotion. "I'd do it all again. Every year of silence, every moment of doubt, every time someone looked at me with pity or dismissed my story as fantasy. I'd do it all again because those 37 men got to go home, because 643 people got to exist." The entire crowd was crying now, grown men openly sobbing. "That's what service means," James said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "It means carrying the weight so others don't have to. It means standing in the darkness so others can walk in the light. It means being willing to be forgotten, to be called crazy, to be dismissed. If it means someone else is remembered, believed, honored. It means choosing the story of others over your own story. And I'd make that choice again tomorrow." He handed the microphone back to David and stepped back, but the crowd didn't let him retreat into the shadows this time. They surged forward, not with pity or awkwardness, but with love, real, unfiltered, overwhelming love. Veterans saluted. Children waved flags. People who'd walked past him for 23 years without seeing him now reached out to shake his hand, to hug him, to thank him, to apologize, to witness him finally. What happened in Riverside Ridge over the next 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The town council voted unanimously to rename Main Street to Mitchell Avenue. The local high school created the Colonel James Mitchell Scholarship for students pursuing military service or careers in public service. Betty's Diner hung a photograph behind the counter, that black and white image of young Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell surrounded by the 37 men he'd saved, helicopter visible in the background. Beneath it, a brass plaque read simply, "A hero drinks here," and James's usual seat at the counter. It was never empty again. Every single morning someone sat with him. Veterans wanting to share their own stories. Teachers bringing students to learn about real heroism. Young people seeking mentorship, people who wanted to hear his memories, not because they were extraordinary tales, but because they were true, because they mattered, because they changed everything. The wall of memories in James's cabin, the maps and photographs and ghosts of missions he'd been ordered to forget, was no longer a shrine to isolation. It became a teaching tool. The Riverside Ridge Historical Society worked with Martin Greaves to document everything, to create an exhibit, to preserve the story for future generations. School groups visited, journalists interviewed him, documentary filmmakers recorded his memories. Colonel James Mitchell, the man who'd been erased from history, became history's most important living witness to the cost of silence and the power of truth. On November 11th, 2020, exactly 1 year later, Riverside Ridge held its Veterans Day ceremony again. But this time, everything was different. A new memorial had been erected in the center of the park, funded entirely by donations from townspeople who felt they had something to atone for. A bronze statue of two soldiers, one kneeling and exhausted, the other standing with his hand extended downward to help lift him up. The plaque at its base read, "Operation Phantom 6, March 28, 1971, in honor of Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell and the men who proved that true heroism is measured not by the battles we win, but by the lives we choose to save." James stood before it, now 74 years old, surrounded by the 37 men who'd come back to Riverside Ridge to celebrate with him. David Patterson put his arm around James's shoulder. "What do you think, Colonel?" James stared at the statue, at this permanent reminder that his sacrifice hadn't been forgotten, that his truth had finally been heard. "I think," James paused, his eyes glistening with tears he no longer felt ashamed to shed. "I think I'm finally home. Here's what I need you to understand. This isn't just a story about one man. It's not even about 37 men. It's about all of us. Every single day we walk past people whose stories we'll never know. People who've sacrificed in ways we can't see. People who carry burdens in silence because the world isn't ready to listen, isn't willing to believe, isn't able to comprehend the weight they bear. Colonel James Mitchell was called delusional for 23 years because his truth was too big for a small town to hold. But the truth doesn't disappear just because people refuse to believe it. It doesn't fade because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. It waits, it endures. It persists like a seed buried in frozen ground, waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right witnesses to finally break through and bloom, and eventually, sometimes after decades, sometimes after lifetimes, truth demands to be heard. It will not be silenced forever. It cannot be buried permanently, because truth has a power that lies do not. Truth has a weight that fantasy cannot match. Truth has witnesses who will not stop searching, will not stop fighting, will not stop believing until it sees daylight. So here's my challenge to you. Wherever you're watching this, whatever city or state or country you're in right now, look around your life, at the quiet people, the ones who don't demand attention or recognition, the ones who show up day after day without fanfare or medals or parades, the ones who carry their stories in silence because no one has thought to ask or listen or believe. Ask their stories, listen to their truths, witness their sacrifices, because heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry medals or stand on podiums. Sometimes they wear faded jackets and sit alone in diners, carrying 643 lives on their shoulders, while the world calls them fantasists. Sometimes they're your neighbor, your co-worker, the old man at the grocery store, the woman who volunteers at the library. Sometimes heroes look like ordinary people because that's exactly what they are. Ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when it mattered most. Ordinary people who chose others over themselves. Ordinary people who stayed behind so others could go home. If this story moved you, if it changed something fundamental in how you see the world, if it's reminded you that every person has a story worth hearing, worth believing, worth honoring, then I need you to do 3 things right now. 1, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to tell stories like James Mitchell's, stories that restore faith in humanity, stories that remind us why honor, sacrifice, and courage still matter in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten. We upload new stories every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday. Stories of veterans, families, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Don't miss them. 2, leave a comment. Tell me about a quiet hero in your life, someone whose story deserves to be heard, someone who's been dismissed or forgotten or called crazy for carrying a truth the world wasn't ready to accept. I read every single comment, and maybe, just maybe, their story will be next. Maybe their truth will be the one we tell to restore someone else's faith. 3, share this video. Send it to your family, your friends, your community, your church, your school, anywhere people gather and stories are told, because the best way to honor Colonel James Mitchell isn't with medals or statues or renamed streets. Those things are important, but they're not enough. The best way to honor him is by making sure we never let another hero go unheard, never let another truth be buried, never let another person carry the weight of 643 lives alone in silence. Colonel James Mitchell passed away peacefully in his sleep on April 3, 2023, at the age of 77. He was surrounded by family, not his blood family, because James never married, never had children of his own, but by the 37 men he'd saved, and their children, and their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. 643 descendants, all of them there because one man chose to give up his seat on a helicopter, because one man decided that 37 strangers' futures mattered more than his own immediate safety. His funeral was held in Riverside Ridge, Montana. The town closed down completely. Every business, every school, every office. Thousands attended, more people than the town had seen in its entire history. They came from all 50 states, veterans, active duty soldiers, civilians who'd never met James, but had been moved by his story, had learned about him from news coverage, from documentaries, from videos like this one. And as his casket was lowered into the ground on a hill overlooking the town he'd called home for 23 difficult years, the honor guard fired a 21-gun salute. Not for a colonel, not for a rank or a title, for a hero, for a man who'd carried the weight of truth in silence, for a witness to sacrifice, the same hero Riverside Ridge had called delusional for 2 decades. Now they knew better. Now they understood. But here's the most important thing. James Mitchell's story didn't end with his death. It's still being told. Right now, as you listen to these words, his story lives. In classrooms across America, where teachers use his example of selfless service. In military academies, where cadets study his decisions under impossible circumstances. In living rooms where families gather to watch videos like this and remember that true heroism is quiet, humble, patient, and often invisible until someone finally shines a light on it. Colonel James Mitchell's story lives on because we refuse to let it die. Because people like you are watching, listening, learning, sharing, and that's the most important lesson of all. Heroes don't need monuments to be remembered. They don't need their names carved in marble or cast in bronze, though those things honor them. What they really need are witnesses. They need people willing to listen. They need people willing to believe. They need us to see them, truly see them before it's too late. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey, through James's pain, his silence, his decades of dismissal, his vindication, his peace. This is American Valor Stories, where we honor the heroes who walk among us unnoticed, where we tell the stories that history tried to erase, that bureaucracy buried, that classification hid from view, where we remind you that courage isn't loud or flashy or demanding. It's quiet, patient, enduring, willing to wait decades for truth to emerge. Colonel James Mitchell taught us that being called crazy doesn't make you wrong. It just means you're carrying a truth the world isn't ready to hear yet. But if you hold that truth with dignity, if you carry it with honor, if you never let bitterness or resentment corrupt it, eventually, the world will catch up. Eventually, the truth will demand its day. Eventually, 643 lives will testify on your behalf. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story, and check out our other videos in the playlist below. Each one is a tribute to the extraordinary ordinary people who change the world one quiet act of courage at a time. People like you, people like the person sitting next to you, people like the veteran you walked past this morning without really seeing. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me about your own quiet hero. And remember, the next time you see someone sitting alone, dismissed by the world, carrying a story no one believes, don't walk past them. Don't ignore them. Don't dismiss them as delusional or confused or living in fantasy. Stop, ask, listen, bear witness, because every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every person you pass carries stories that could change you if you'd only take the time to hear them. And sometimes all they need is one person to believe them. One person to listen. One person to say, I see you. I hear you. Your truth matters. Be that person. Be the person who stops and listens. Be the person who believes when everyone else dismisses. Be the person who carries someone else's truth until the world is ready to hear it. That's what David Patterson did. That's what Martin Greaves did. That's what those 37 men did when they drove across the country to testify. They chose to be witnesses, and now you can be a witness too. You've heard James Mitchell's story. You know his truth. You understand his sacrifice. Don't let it end here. Share it. Tell it. Make sure the next person knows that heroes walk among us in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see them. God bless you. God bless our veterans, those who serve in silence and those whose service is celebrated. God bless the quiet heroes carrying truths too big for the world to hold. God bless the witnesses who refuse to let those truths die. And God bless the United States of America, a nation built on the sacrifices of people whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never told, whose truth waited decades or centuries to finally see light. This has been American Valor Stories. Subscribe for more stories that honor courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. New episodes every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Until next time, remember, every person has a story. Every story matters. And sometimes, the most important story is the one nobody believed until someone finally chose to listen.